This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a lecturer in international history and politics at the University of Leeds in the UK, and the editor of the recently published memoir of Leah Trachtman-Palchan, his great-aunt, who, like so many other Jews whose life spanned the bulk of the 20th century, had a remarkable story. A typically remarkable story is perhaps the best way to describe it. The book Between Tel Aviv and Moscow, A Life of Dissent and Exile in Mandate Palestine and the Soviet Union, has just been published in English by Radcliffe. Dr. Nir Arielli, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me.
So, just to go briefly, Leah was born in 1913 in Tsarist Russia and together with her family fled the pogroms to Palestine in 1921. She then became involved with the local Communist Party that was the enemy of both the British and the Zionists in Palestine. In 1931, she was deported back to what was by then the Soviet Union, and nearly 40 years later, she was allowed to come back to what by then had become the State of Israel, where she died in 1995. As I said in the beginning, quite a remarkable story. So let's start in the beginning. Aged 8, she settles in Palestine with her family. What was their attitude towards Zionism before and after their immigration?
Well, as you know, there was a great movement of people leaving what was then Tsarist Russia and soon become Soviet Union. So a lot of people were seeking to leave. The majority, for a generation, had been migrating mainly to America and smaller numbers to Britain and other countries. And a very small proportion were making their way to Palestine. Leah's family as well, my grandmother's family, was a bit torn on this issue, so they weren't quite sure where they'd want to go. The father wanted to go to America to join family members who had gone there, while the mother wanted to come to Palestine because she had family members already here. And as in many family arguments, the wife, of course, won, and they came to Palestine. They arrived in 1921. With very little. They had very little. They were very poor refugees.
Mm-hmm. And what was their life like after they landed?
Well, their life was quite simple. They lived in Tel Aviv, in the area where a lot of the new immigrants lived. They were living in a shack to begin with. The parents tried to eke out a living, working in the market and doing a host of other things. They weren't making a lot of money, but steadily their living conditions improved. They moved to slightly more comfortable accommodation, and then gradually they were settling into life in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. And how was the young Leah, by then a teenager, drawn to the Communist Party, which was a very marginal group at the time?
You're absolutely right. If you read the memoir, she describes it almost as an accidental occurrence. She was a member of the Scouts, and then her leaders, her guides, broke away and started a new movement which was called Amal. And it later transpired that this was actually a front for the Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party, as you said, was tiny, only had a few hundred members at any given time in the 1920s and 30s, but it was also illegal. So the British Mandate authorities forbade any communist activity, and all their activities had to be conducted underground. Leah, at least according to her memoirs, wasn't aware of all this to begin with and kind of gets drawn into it as a teenager. And she comes across, I think, as quite naive at this stage.
Mm-hmm. So what was it that actually kept it there if it wasn't ideology? It was some sort of a teenage love?
Well, I think to begin with, she was quite keen about the ideology. Equality appealed to her. She was a very compassionate person. So a lot of the positive sides of communism appealed to her. There's also the friendship issue. So she had good friends there. And at least my grandmother believed so for many years. Her love for one of the older boys in the group, a guy named Meir Slonim.
Mm-hmm. And her attitude towards Zionism. I mean, at the end of the day, being a communist wasn't only about equality in Palestine of the 1920s and 30s. It was also about being adamantly and rabidly anti-Zionist. Did she subscribe to anti-Zionism as an ideology?
That's a good question. I think that part of my problem, at least, is I'm working with a text that Leah wrote in her 70s. And by then, we'll come back to this later on, she'd come back to Israel, a firm Zionist. So it was a bit difficult for her to put herself into the shoes of the adolescent Leah, who I believe was much more firmly ideologically communist than perhaps the older Leah gives her credit. So she was... She describes a couple of arguments she had with her mother about Zionism and about how, let's say, back in Russia, the family was discriminated against for being Jewish, and here they are discriminated against for being communist. But I think a lot of this is filtered in the memoir, and this is part of the issue we have, we historians have, when we work with texts that were written in retrospect.
Sure. And what was the attitude of her immediate circles, her family, her friends, to that political involvement? I mean, being a member of the Communist Party meant being very politically involved. Mm-hmm. Was it frowned upon by her family, by her friends?
I think her family was very unenthusiastic. Her parents both tried to persuade her to stop. My grandmother also was never keen about any of this activity. Her closest friends by this stage were party members, were friends of hers who were undergoing the same process. So illegal demonstrations, handing out leaflets, being arrested, that was part of the problem. As a very young girl, she spent quite a few months in prison.
Mm-hmm. And what was the thing that led to her deportation later on at 18 in 1931? I mean, you had to do some very bad things to be deported to the Soviet Union, right?
Well, ironically, not really. One could get arrested for very minor, even sort of people were arrested for carrying around propaganda material. The issue
what was that grounds for deportation?
The issue with the deportation was not only the communist activity per se, but the ability of the Mandate authorities to deport people who didn't have Palestinian citizenship. Mm-hmm. Now, apparently, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, many people who came over in the 20s and 30s never bothered with a Palestinian citizenship. Perhaps they didn't want to lose their European citizenship. Perhaps they didn't even think in these terms.
Yeah, they were too busy with survival.
Yes, exactly. And Leah wasn't a citizen of Palestine. They never bothered to get the paperwork in. And her, and she's of course not alone in this, like many others, she was deported because A, she was breaking the law, and B, she wasn't a citizen. Mm-hmm. So that enabled the authorities to deport her. And I've found files of dozens and dozens of people who've experienced the same fate, either sent back to the Soviet Union or to various other European countries.
Mm-hmm. Were they all communist or?
Absolutely, yes. To the best of my knowledge, no Jewish residents of Palestine were deported for any other reason. Mm-hmm. Except for being communist.
Interesting. And when she arrived back in the beginning of the 1930s, it was perhaps the golden age of Stalinism, of communism in the Soviet Union. What was her reaction to it, and how soon did she become disillusioned with communism?
Leah arrives in 1931 in Odessa, and she arrives with an idea of how the Soviet Union is going to look like. And one of the first things she sees are orphans who live on the street in miserable poverty, begging for food. And she's quite surprised. I think it takes quite a while for this to sink in. But along the way, first in Odessa and later in Moscow, she encounters quite a few things that kind of force her to reconsider her concepts of communism, of Stalin's benign regime, all kinds of ideas that she brought with her.
So that was almost immediate.
Well, I think the first scenes in Odessa stayed with her, but I think she's still very much a devout communist in Moscow in the first few years. She works in a factory. She goes to all the meetings. She's quite ideologically firm. But I think the true turning point comes with the Great Terror, with the trials, with the arrests, and with the fact that a lot of the other sort of political exiles that were forced out of Palestine and sent to the Soviet Union began to be arrested in Moscow and to disappear all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. That was in the 1950s.
No, this is in the late 1930s.
Right.
So 1937 is the peak year of the Great Terror, the purges. This starts, already, let's say, 1936.
Mm-hmm. And is that where Zionism starts to sink back in?
Not quite yet. I think that for Zionism to make a comeback for Leah, it only comes after the Second World War, when she's a mother, and the regime turns increasingly anti-Semitic. In late 1940s and early 1950s, I think by that stage she's quite disillusioned with communism. And certainly by the 1960s, when her children are a bit older, they become involved in the Zionist movement. So by the late 1960s, it's pretty safe to say that her small family is all kind of keen on Zionism and leaving the Soviet Union.
What can you tell us about her family, about her husband, about her children, politically that is?
Her husband was another Jewish man who had lived in Palestine, was like Leah, deported to the Soviet Union. His name was Michael Palchan. He was deported around about the same time. They meet in Moscow. They work in the same factory. They marry before the Second World War, and they have their first child. Then they're forced to leave Moscow. When the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, they're evacuated with the factory to Siberia. They then have a second child. Also, they not exactly adopt, but take in a third child whose parents were arrested and sent to the Gulag, sent to the Stalinist detention camps. So that's the nuclear family. Mm-hmm. And they survived the Second World War in extremely hard conditions in Siberia, then returned to Moscow, and they stay in the Moscow area pretty much continuously until they leave in 1971.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take until they were allowed to leave? And again, it was pretty unusual for Jews to be allowed to leave in the early 1970s. Did it take a lot of hard work to get that visa and go to Israel?
Yes, it did. The refusnik movements, as they were called, people who were refused permission to leave the Soviet Union, began to gain momentum, let's say, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Then I think the Soviet Union made a political decision to release a pressure valve, so to let a few tens of thousands of troublemakers leave and hopefully end the whole problem there. You must bear in mind that there was quite a bit of political pressure during this period of the Cold War. A lot of people in the West campaigning for Jews to be allowed to leave the Soviet Union.
Was Leah one of those troublemakers?
Well, I think Leah by this stage is a lot more cautious than she was as a young woman, but her sons certainly are quite active in this movement.
How old were they by then?
They were born in the late 30s and 40s, so they're in their sort of 20s and 30s by this stage. Leah is very supportive of this, but I don't think she's a kind of a frontline activist by this stage.
Was her husband also a communist turned Zionist by then?
He was a communist, I can't say for sure, but I don't think he was never extremely passionate about his communism. And I think, like Leah, he becomes disillusioned with the regime and with its anti-Semitism.
And when they arrive in Israel in 1971, where she ends her life a couple of decades later, it's probably a very different Israel to the one that she knew. What was her reaction to her return?
It is. I should say that this part of her life doesn't figure in the memoir. So the memoir stops in 1956. In 1956, Leah is given a very, very unique opportunity just to go to Israel to visit her family members. So the memoir ends there.
Including your grandmother?
Including my grandmother. The official reason was that her parents were old and unwell, and she was given permission. This was during the leadership of Khrushchev, so there was a thaw, a slight relaxing of the Stalinist kind of police state. So she's given permission to go visit Israel in 1956, and she's quite taken by the Israel she sees there. The 1971 period, when she comes back to live in Israel, isn't in the memoir. They live in the Haifa area. I think that they were quite content. She later on started an ulpan for new immigrants, new olim that came later on from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and 90s. Michael worked, he was an engineer, he worked in the electricity company. I think they were quite satisfied.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember her? Did you know her well?
Well, this is a funny thing. I think I only met Leah a couple of times. She came to my bar mitzvah, and I met her as a boy. As boys and adolescents often are, one isn't really interested in older relatives. It's only later on when I started studying history that I became really interested in this story, this kind of fantastic...
But by then she had already died.
Yes, sadly she had died already. I had quite a few conversations with my grandmother, who also passed away, about Leah and about the whole period when she was arrested and deported. And a few years ago, her son, Leah's son, asked me to have a look at the translated manuscript, which he wanted to have published in English. So that gave me an opportunity to dive into the story once again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is all very, very interesting, and I really encourage all our listeners to delve into the story of Leah Trachtman-Palchan, whom I have to admit I'd never heard about until I came across this book, and it's really worth a read. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Nir Arielli, a lecturer in international history and politics at the University of Leeds, and the editor of Leah Trachtman-Palchan, your great aunt's memoirs. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
לא קל להאמין, הרגעים מעטים, וצריך את הזמן להבין את סוד הדברים הפשוטים. יש חור בלב שאנחנו רצים כדי למלא, בלי לשאול למי זה כואב וכמה עולה. אם נדע לתת בלי לבקש להחזיר, עוד נגלה את האמת שלמה